Man, my sickness benefits really suck. I've been out of work for so long that my employer is no longer offering me paid leave.
Sickness benefits here in the US provide less than other countries such as those in Europe.
Oh, really? I had no idea. What are sickness benefits like in Europe?
The government guarantees sickness benefits for all people in paid employment in Europe. This assistance can cover up to 80% of the worker's earnings for over a year or for an unlimited period of time in some countries.
That's much more extensive than in the US. There's no federal sickness benefit here, and only 5 states provide any form of it. Employers cover barely over half the employee's earnings, at most, and it's capped at a year.
Not only does Europe have more generous sickness benefits, but they're more liberal with the amount of resources they invest into healthcare and disability benefits in general. For example, many European countries provide universal healthcare coverage and unlimited benefits, while the United States relies on two specific programs, Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the low-income households, which both have limitations.
So that means that besides a deductible, the household doesn't have to pay anything in European countries if a member gets sick?
Exactly.
Do these benefits hold true in case I get injured on the job? I know that I wouldn't get too much if I had a disability because of how much I make, but is there anything different about the way disabilities are treated in Europe?
Yeah, there actually is. In the US, disability pension is based solely on average monthly earnings, while in European countries, there are many other factors at play, like years of contribution. In some cases, there is actually a basic minimum pension that's augmented by an additional income-based pension. If you perform the calculations, it turns out that the US disability benefits only amount to about 43% of the average wage, while countries like Sweden provide up to 80% in disability benefits. In general, European countries have more labor market regulations to protect the workers from business interests that can jeopardize the workers' jobs.
So that would include things like mandated long paid vacation, generous sick leaves, shorter work hours, and high costs for firing employees?
Right. European countries spend 5 times more than what Americans do on things like unemployment insurance and labor market programs.
So I understand all these programs in Europe that work to alleviate the burden of things like sickness and poverty. These programs only affect people in very niche situations where they can't support themselves. What about some aspects that affect most people, regardless of their income or health, like the hardships that come with having children?
Having a child has a significant financial impact on most families. So child benefits exist in European countries like Germany and Sweden for all parents, regardless of their income level. These benefits can even be extended if the child seeks higher education, whereas in the US, these types of family allowances are non-existent, besides certain allowances for children of low-income families who desperately need the assistance.
It seems like the welfare state in Europe is more generous as a whole than the welfare state in the US.
Definitely. In Europe, countries rely on unconditional and unlimited relief plans to support those who can't support themselves and are mired in poverty, but don't fit into any of the aforementioned categories. The US has many different plans in place that target different groups, many of which are limited in terms of time period that the assistance can take place. For example, a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families is limited to 2 years of assistance.
So how is such an extensive welfare state sustainable for the government? I'm assuming that there are higher tax rates to cover all these different sections.
Europeans not only have higher tax rates, they have more progressive tax rates, so that people with higher income have a higher tax rate comparatively. This means that European countries have a more radical wealth redistribution than the US.
So if the higher revenue from taxes in Europe is grounds for all of these beneficial welfare programs and more wealth redistribution to the poor, why do Americans always get so worked up whenever politicians even allude to anything related to raising taxes?
That's a good point. And by looking at the statistics and the differences in the systems, there isn't a completely clear explanation. The main reason for this stems from the different attitudes between Americans and Europeans regarding the poor. In the US, only 29% of people believe that the poor are trapped in poverty. On the other hand, 60% of Europeans believe that the poor are trapped in poverty and that it isn't any fault of their own that they are poor. Adding on to this, 60% of Americans believe that the poor are lazy, while only 26% of Europeans think the same. For the most part, Europeans are more willing to pay taxes to redistribute wealth to the poor, while Americans are reluctant to do so.
I think that Americans have an underlying faith in social mobility and the ideology that working hard will bring you success, and that the poor simply don't work hard enough. This relates to the American dream, where if you work hard, you will succeed, regardless of how little you start with.
The idea is definitely prevalent in American culture. In an ideal world, everyone should have an equal opportunity at prosperity, but unfortunately, that's not the case.
Even if somebody works hard, there are often outside forces that restrain them. Because of that, it is necessary to have these welfare states to assist people. Is there any truth to the idea that social mobility is more prevalent in the US than in Europe?
Well, not really. There is a misconception that it is easier to move up in American society than in Europe, and this would mean that the poor are less demanding of redistribution if they feel there is potential to be wealthy. While there is more social mobility between the middle and the upper class in the US, there's actually less social mobility between the lower and middle class. It is actually easier for the poor to escape poverty in Europe than in the United States.
Even if there is not more social mobility in the US, aren't the classes economically more equal than in Europe? That would mean that the welfare state would not be as integral.
It's true that the more equal societies do not need welfare states as much as unequal societies, but the US does have more economic inequality along with economic volatility. That is why it is untrue when people say that Europeans' higher inequality and volatility leads to a bigger welfare state. Even though before taxes and transfers, European countries are more equal than the US, they have a more robust welfare state.
So if more economic inequality in Europe isn't the reason for the increased wealth redistribution, could it just be due to the sheer wealth of European countries? After all, since Europe is so rich, it's only natural for it to have better established wealth redistribution systems and forms of social insurance.
Well, richer countries are more likely to have more wealth redistribution and insurance programs, but that concept doesn't really apply here because the US and many European countries are the richest in the world when compared to other countries that are still developing. Despite this, we still see significant differences in the extent of redistribution and generosity with regards to insurance, speaking to some other reason that causes these differences to arise.
Well, if none of these reasons suffice, isn't it possible that the US and European countries have just always had different ideologies and systems that have been set up?
Well, the differences between the US and European welfare states did not actually arise until after World War I. The US even leaned more towards a liberal supportive welfare state in the 19th century, and it was not until the early 20th century that the welfare states in Europe became more liberal. This also discredits the belief on the other side of the spectrum that the differences arose after World War II because the US and European countries were already heading in separate directions at that time.
So then, why did the US and European countries start to differ after World War I?
The basic idea is that US had a system similar to what it has today during the 19th century, while in Europe, there's a major transition from monarchies or elite aristocracies to democracies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Starting as early as the late 19th century, many small European countries did not have armies large enough to suppress the liberal national uprisings. This overthrew the old governments and put new systems and constitutions into place. The US is a large enough country that an uprising in one part of the country was not large enough to alter the federal government.
What about the larger European countries? Were things any different for them?
In the aftermath of World War I, the armies of the larger countries were in shambles, so they were not able to suppress the liberal national uprisings. The US didn't have nearly as much involvement in the war, and it was not fought here, so the armies were still intact. The new constitutions had the influence of communist and socialist ideologies on the European countries, so that they leaned more towards proportional representation.
Oh, so a big part of the differences come from these changes that affected political systems in the US and Europe after World War I. So if Europe has a system of proportional representation in place, that means that even minorities and smaller, more extreme left parties can be represented in parliament without having to win the plurality. Instead, they just have to win a small portion of the votes to get a few seats. That makes it a lot easier for these smaller parties to still have some sway in passing legislation regarding welfare. The US has the Electoral College system in place, along with a separate election for members of Congress, where only one party can be represented per branch of government.
Well, like you said, the proportional representation in Europe empowers minorities to make their voices heard. The smaller leftist parties and minorities are the ones who will likely favor welfare so they can advocate heavily for things like wealth redistribution with their few seats in parliament. In the US majoritarian system, whichever party wins the plurality is the one that is represented in government. Since it's less likely for a smaller, extreme left party to beat out already established ones, they are more reluctant to organize. The parties in the US that would normally be the ones advocating heavily for welfare are not represented in the majoritarian system, while they are in the European system of proportional representation. This creates grounds for the differences we see in the welfare state of both countries. The system in US was intentionally set up to snuff the voices of the black minority. The Electoral College evolved under the influence of whites, mainly Southerners, who used lawsuits in Supreme Court cases to have laws that limited the influence of minorities.
But there are still major differences within countries regarding their views on welfare. For example, the US has 3 branches of government that can all disagree on what course of action to take, while in Europe, the presence of coalitions makes it hard for one party to push all their legislations through. The president and members of Congress are elected separately in the US, an election scheme that allows for different branches of government to be kept in check by each other if Congress and the presidency are held by different parties.
These differences in ideology that you mentioned between branches of government can heavily hinder those who are pro-wealth redistribution in the US, such as what happened when the pro-redistribution President FDR was faced with a very conservative Congress. The Supreme Court is another aspect of the system of checks and balances in the US. It has historically limited extremely progressive moves linked to wealth redistribution, such as raising income tax too high. Due to the nature of coalitions in Europe, it's hard for the party in power to completely resist demands for things like public spending due to the fact that they must comply to the desires of the other parties in their coalition. Also, the Prime Minister is always chosen to be the leader of the party with the most votes in the winning coalition. This ensures that the Prime Minister and the biggest group in Parliament are always from the same party, preventing the methods of checks and balances that could arise.
The role of minority parties seem to have a substantial effect on the welfare state. But do racial or ethnic minorities also factor into the equation?
The presence of racial and ethnic minorities really changes how people view the welfare state. People are more likely to support people who they share similarities with and can empathize more easily with. This means that areas with more racial and ethnic heterogeneity have less supportive welfare programs. This trend is crystal clear in American states, where the degree of homogeneity directly correlates with the size of the welfare state. States with a more dense white population, like Minnesota, have monumentally larger welfare programs than states with higher black populations, like Mississippi.
So I guess that's why the black population is much more supportive of the welfare state across the board, even when controlling for income. It seems odd that race and ethnicity have a sizable effect on the welfare state. Even though there are definitely fervent racists out there, I would not expect such a large chunk of the population to have race and ethnicity affect how they view welfare.
Not all prejudice comes from ardent racists. It is not innate that people have these negative views regarding the welfare state in regards to the minorities. But these differences are capitalized upon by politicians to push their own agenda.
So a politician who does not support the welfare state will use racial or ethnic differences to alienate and build hatred towards a minority population?
And they also use this tactic to discredit their opponent. They stress that the welfare disproportionately aids minorities.
Why would this have a more noticeable effect on the US than European countries? There is definitely a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe that politicians have used to advance their agenda.
This political strategy is indeed used in both the US and Europe, but it is definitely more prominent in the US. Since the US is more diverse and has more heterogeneity racially and ethnically, politicians find more differences that they can use. The impact of this tactic is manifested in people's views towards who receives welfare. White people underestimate the amount of welfare that goes to the white lower class, and they overestimate the amount of welfare that goes to the black lower class. This shows that the politicians have exploited the racial and ethnic differences to build animosity towards the minorities.
So this animosity towards government aid for minorities has been built up for a long period of time.
Yeah. In the 1880s, the first pro-redistribution party in the United States history, called the Populists, began to form. They initially aimed to gain support from the African American population, since their party's views would benefit that population the most. There was a backlash from the conservative whites, who spread stories of black crime to build racial hatred. The Populist Party shifted to eventually support the Jim Crow policies that took away redistribution from those African Americans.
So that means the different political institutions and racial or ethnic presences in Europe and the US are the reasons for the different welfare programs.